Welcome to day 43 of 100 Days of Code. Today we're going to be learning how to style our website with CSS. And this is going to form your introduction to the CSS design language. This is going to finally allow us to add some color, add some styling, and make our websites look good as well as function. We're going to be using these skills to upgrade our CV to a personal site where we can potentially keep our portfolio and also a record of all the projects that we've built before. Once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and let's get started learning about the CSS language. All right, guys, we are leveling up. In this module, we're going to talk about cascading style sheets. First, let's understand why CSS was created and why it's necessary. Now, if you think back to the 90s, web developers wanted to style up their websites, making it look the way that they wanted to. And it wasn't always pretty. But the tool set that they had in order to do this were very, very limited. And this is what it might look like if you only had HTML to style your websites. And as an aside, this is a real website and you can still visit it at this URL. Now, in order to style up the website using pure HTML, which is all they really had access to, they had to use HTML tags. For example, the font tag, which you can use to change the font of the text being displayed. And you can also use things like the center tag, which simply centers any element on screen. Now, in addition to that, people also used attributes. For example, you can set the H1's background color using the background color attribute to a particular color hex code, and that would change the H1 to a different color. Now, the problem really comes along when you start messing around with the layout using just HTML. Because as we've seen, in order to change our layout for our personal website so that we can have text and images that exist side by side, we had to use tables. And the problem with tables is that they are really, really wordy. You have to write a lot of code in order to do something very simple, which is displaying that image next to your H1 and your paragraphs, having it on the same horizontal level. And look at how much code we had to write just to do that simple thing. Now, the other problem with tables is that it's very, very easy to make syntax errors, and it's very easy to mess up. If you say, forgot a TD here, you would end up with errors all over the place, and it's very difficult to debug as well. And also, if you started getting into more complex table layouts, you had to embed tables within tables in order to get more columns and more rows and more flexible layout, and the whole thing just became this horrible, horrible mess. So that's why people started using something called cascading style sheets. And this is what's called a style sheet or a style language, in the sense that it can't really do anything by itself. Its only purpose in life is to style markup language, so for example HTML or XML code. And in this module, we're going to explore all the powerful things that you can do with cascading style sheets to bring your website from the 90s into the current day and age. So enough talking, let's get started styling up our website using CSS. Now, even in its current state, our website already compares pretty favorably with our computer science professors' websites. So we're definitely doing something right here. But we can make it even better. If you take a look at the personal website of Sean Halpin, who's a web designer, this is one of the most beautiful personal websites I've ever come across. It's incredibly simple, but it's also really beautiful and really well designed. So this is going to be our inspiration for this CSS module. And I'm going to show you how, by using the powers of CSS and everything that you're going to learn in this module, we're going to elevate the design of our personal site to look something like this and bring it right into the 21st century. So the first thing that would already make our website look a little bit nicer is changing this pretty bland white background to a colored background. So if you head over to your code file and open up index.html, we can inject a little bit of CSS right into the HTML tag that we want to affect. And the tag that we're interested in is the body tag, because we know that most, if not all, of our displayed content on our website is enclosed inside this body tag. So if we change its background, then the entire website's background will change too. So inside this body tag, we're going to tap into an attribute called style. And style takes CSS code inside the quotation marks. So the style that we want to change is the background color. So I'm going to write background dash color, and I'm going to write a colon. And after that colon, I'm going to specify the color that I want for the body. And let's just start off with a blue color. And then we're going to close off this line of CSS code using a semicolon. Now, if at this point you find that Atom is highlighting your code in a slightly different color scheme to mine, so for example, the part which says background color blue, instead of the green text I've got, you've got white and yellow like this, don't worry about it. That's just something specific to your computer, and it doesn't mean that you've done anything wrong. Just make sure that you've got the semicolon that closes off that background color blue, and then you've got the double quotes around that entire style. And once you've checked those things, then you can continue on. And now if I hit save, and if I go back to my browser, then if you hit refresh, you'll see our CSS code being implemented, changing the entire background of our web page. Now, if the background color is not changing for you, make sure that you're actually looking at the copy of the website that you're working on and not the GitHub version. This is where our development is going to happen. So if you don't have it up, remember you can simply right-click and go to copy full path and paste it in here in order to get to that website under development. Now, the question you might have at this stage, beside the question of how did we manage to get our website looking even uglier than before, just bear with me on that, but the question that most students have is, well, how did you know to use background color? And how did you know that blue as a color would work? Let's see how we can find out how to do this. So if I head over to Google and we search for change background color using CSS, and we're going to tag on MDN at the end because that's our preferred documentation. And you can see that the first link that shows up already takes us to the documentation on the background color. And this page explains that the background color is a CSS property which sets the background color of a particular element. So we've used this particular line to change the background color of our body HTML element to blue. Now, as it shows, we can also do this using hex values or hexadecimal values. So we can replace this really ugly looking blue with something that is custom. And a really good tool for finding beautiful colors and beautiful color palettes is a website called colorhunt.co. And here you've got professional designers who've curated some of their favorite color palettes, and they've provided the hex codes to implement them in your own designs. So you can search by hot or popular, and we're going to look for a nice color palette that is going to work for our particular project. So I'm going to choose this one. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy the hex value of this nice sort of light pastel green bluey color. And I'm going to replace the word blue with that hex value. And remember, whenever you're using hex values, it needs to have the pound sign, or you might see it as the hashtag sign in front. Now, as soon as we add that hex code, you'll notice that one of our plugins that we installed in the beginning, the one called Pigments, is highlighting that color to us to show us what it'll look like when it's implemented. But we're going to verify that on our website as well. So let's go ahead and hit save and go back to our website and hit refresh. And you can see that beautiful light green color is now showing across our web page. So the other question that you might have is, how can I figure out which colors I can use just by specifying the name of it, and which ones I have to use as a hex value? Well, again, let's head over to Google and we're going to look for an answer to our query. And I know that I've been banging on about this point, but it's really, really important, because as a fully fledged web developer, one of the most important skills is finding and figuring out how to do something that is specific to your needs. So inevitably, at some point in your future career, you will need to build features or implement things that we haven't ever talked about. And it's important that you really start building up this skill of figuring out what are the best keywords to search for, how do I structure my searches, which sources am I going to go to, be it Google or Stack Overflow or MDN, in order to figure out how I can do this specific thing that I want to do. And that's why I want to show you my thought process in order to guide you on how you can start doing this for yourself as well. So whenever you come across something that you want to figure out or you want to do that isn't covered in the tutorials, I want you to first give it a go, looking and seeing if you can figure it out for yourself, because this is one of the most important skills that you need to learn as a developer. So let's go ahead and search for CSS colors, and if we hit enter, you'll see that Google has picked out this particular table on the MDN website, and it has keywords and RGB hex values. So let's go ahead and take a look at it in more detail. So this is a page that I recommend you bookmarking even, because it describes the color CSS data type that's available to you when you use CSS. And if you scroll down, there's this really useful table that shows you the colors and the keywords that you can use in order to implement these colors in your code without ever having to dive into the hex code. So for example, maybe you want the background to be this powder blue, right? So you can go ahead and simply copy this keyword, and instead of using the hex code, we can simply use the word powder blue. And if we refresh our website, you can see that that color is automatically rendered because it's recognized as a valid CSS color. So this is a quick and easy way of implementing colors using CSS. Now there's a whole range of other ways that you can change the color using CSS, and I'll leave you to read through this documentation and take a look at some of the other ways or some of the other palettes that you can tap into. Now heading back to our personal site, the next thing that I want to change is the style of these horizontal rules. And you might realize that there's a little bit of difficulty involved in doing this, because as nice as it is, modifying the style of a particular HTML element by simply going into the tag and changing the style attribute, it's a little bit cumbersome when you want to do that to many repeated elements. For example, our horizontal rules, because I have a total of about 4 of them, and I would have to write up the CSS code and copy and paste into each and every one of these tags. Now, if at some point I decide to change one of these CSS values, say, I actually prefer this light color over this powder blue, and I'm going to change it back to that particular hex code, then I would have to remember to change it in all 4 places. And this is very, very error prone. So in the next lesson, I'm going to show you another way that you can implement CSS code that will apply across the entire web page, and it's by using internal CSS. You can look forward to that in the next lesson. See you there. So in the last lesson, we looked at how we're able to change the background color of the body of our web page by simply injecting CSS code in the same line as our body HTML element. Now, in this lesson, we're going to look at how we can implement CSS code across the entire web page, so we won't have to copy and paste the style attribute each time we want to change a particular element. So in order to do this, we're going to go into the head section of our HTML page, and just below the title, I'm going to add a style tag, and I'm going to close it off as well. Now, in between the style tag, I'm going to select the HTML element that I want to affect. So let's first try this with our body element. So in order to select an HTML tag, all you have to do is specify the name of the element you want to change, which in this case is the body. And then you're going to create a set of curly braces, inside which you're going to write your CSS code that will affect the style of the body element. So let's hit enter and give ourselves a bit more space. And let's also indent this so that it's nested inside our style tag. So here I can copy this line of code straight in like so. So the essential elements of any CSS code that you're going to write is going to be something that you want to affect. So in this case, it's the body of the page that we want to change. And then it's what you want to change about it. So in this case, it's the background color property that we want to affect. And finally, what is the value that you're going to change it to, which in this case is that nice color from our color palette. So I want to go ahead and just change this to a more obvious color. So back to that pretty ugly blue looking color that we had before. And I'm going to delete our inline CSS here and make it go back to just a simple body tag, just so that we can confirm that our code is in fact working. So now if we hit save and we go back to our website and we hit refresh, you can see that that change has worked. So we know that our CSS code is functional and it is working. Now, sometimes when you're linking up CSS with your HTML file, you might have forgotten a closing tag, or you might have put it into the wrong place. For example, you accidentally had it inside the body instead of the head section. And there's all sorts of reasons why your CSS and your HTML might not be linked together. So it's always a good idea just to change something really, really dramatic so that you can just confirm that the entire style tag is working and it's affecting the appearance of your web page. So now let's change this back to that prettier color that we had, and let's check to make sure that it's working. And the next thing that we're going to change is what we mentioned before. We want to change the style of something that occurs repeatedly in our code, which is the horizontal rule. Now, instead of having to write the style attribute inside each and every single one of these tags, what I can do is I can simply select it here by saying, let's change the style of all the horizontal rules. And the property of the horizontal rule that I want to change is also its background color. I don't like this grayish thing that we've got here, and I want it to just be pure white. So I want its background color to be simply just white, a CSS color that we can have access to just by writing the keyword white. So if we hit save and we head over to our website, you'll notice that nothing changes when you refresh it. It hasn't changed in its appearance at all. So why is that? Well, it's really, really important to realize that no website is completely unstyled. So what does that mean? Even before we've added any CSS code to our index.html, there is already some default CSS being applied by your browser. Now, you can find out what the default CSS looks like by, again, searching for it. So let's search for browser default CSS and hit enter. And you can see that the first thing that we get is actually from W3 schools. So I'm pretty agnostic towards which sources we use as long as they're useful. And Google's always pretty good at picking out which is the most used, or rather most useful links, and put them at the top of your searches. So if we look inside W3 schools, you can see that all these elements have default CSS values being applied by your browser. Now, if we hit Command F to find the horizontal rule, then you can see all the default CSS that it has. Now, let me just talk you through what all of this does. Now, the first thing is that it sets a margin for our horizontal rule, and then it sets the type or the style of our border to something called inset. And then it gives the border a width of 1 pixel. So what is this border style inset? Well, let's take a look at border style CSS using MDN. And you can see that there's a whole bunch of different keywords that you can use that changes the border style. Now you'll also find the default one, which is the inset border style. And this displays a border that makes the element look embedded. And if you look really closely at our border, it's kind of got that effect, right? Even though it's not that nice looking, that happens to be the default style that's specified by our browser. So let's change it to something that we want. Well, we actually don't really want a border. All we want is just to have a single line without a border that is white in color, right? So we can change the border style to none, and we can override the default browser value by specifying a new value for it using CSS. So we're going to say border style to none. And if we hit save, something surprising is going to happen when you refresh your website. Your horizontal rules have disappeared. Now, why is that? Well, one of the most important concepts in learning CSS is realizing that pretty much everything that exists on the web page are essentially just boxes. And I can make those boxes appear by using this Chrome plugin I've got, which is called Pesticide. Now, in order to get hold of this Pesticide for Chrome extension, head over to the course resources and you'll see a link that takes you directly to this extension on the Chrome Web Store. And this is an extension that we've published, and all you have to do to get it is just click Add to Chrome, Add Extension, and then final step that you need to do is to go here in the top right corner, click on the 3 dots, and then go to your Chrome settings. And then here, I want you to go into extensions, find the Pesticide for Chrome extension, and I want you to go to details. Inside details, make sure that this part, allow access to file URLs, is turned on. This is going to allow you to develop your website locally and to allow you to use Pesticide on your local websites. Now, finally, if you want to pin the Pesticide extension so that it shows up here, click on the extensions and then go ahead and click pin so that it shows up right here, and then you're ready to go. Now, back in your website, if you click on the Pesticide button, then it will highlight all the boxes that we have on screen. Now, the horizontal rule is no exception. It's also just a rectangle. And that rectangle used to have a border specified by this border style. And that border had a width. So it was 1 pixel on the top, 1 pixel on the bottom, 1 pixel on the left, and 1 pixel on the right. Now, by getting rid of that border, by setting border style to none, our rectangle now has no size. It's literally 0 pixels high. So in order to change this situation, we need to change some of the CSS for the box to give it a height. So if you head over to DevDocs, day43.io and you search for height, the first one, the blue icon here, shows you that this is CSS related documentation. And if you click on it, it takes you to this height CSS property. And this specifies the height of an element. And you can read that as this thing changes the height of your box. So if we now give our horizontal rule a height, let's say 2 pixels, and we hit save, once we hit refresh, our box now has an actual dimension. And you can see that here as well. You can see that that tiny box now has a little bit of height associated with it, whereas previously it had 0 pixels in height, because only the border had a dimension to it. Now, that height property isn't unique to just the horizontal rule. And this is the really interesting thing about CSS. Now, once you realize that essentially everything in your web page is just a whole bunch of boxes, and the properties of these boxes can be affected by changing the CSS code, then you can pretty much apply the same rules or the same changes to any of these boxes you choose. So, for example, if I wanted to select my image HTML element, then I could write image and I can change its height to something less extreme, maybe something like 20 pixels. And if I hit save and refresh, then you'll see that the box for my image has now become super tiny, and it is now only 20 pixels high. Now, some of you might have tried to change the height of the body, and you might have gotten stuck and wondered, why did it not work for the body? Well, it's down to the fact that the body has some default values that prevents our changing the height. And we're going to look at some of those things like display block in later lessons in this module to understand why that is. But for now, let's get rid of this style that we applied to the image, and let's hit save, and let's see our website as it is. Now, if you go into DevDocs and you go to the CSS section, then you can look at all of these subsections of how you can change the appearance of any element. So one of the things that you can change, in addition to the height, is actually the width of your element. So we can go and say the width of our horizontal rule should only ever be 100 pixels. And we hit save and we refresh, then you see that this is 100 pixels wide. Now, sometimes you might want the width to change depending on whether if you're viewing your website on a smartphone or whether if you're viewing on a browser or if somebody's viewing it maybe on an iPad. So you might not want to specify a straight up hard-coded value such as 100 pixels. You can also specify a percentage. So you can say the width should be 30% of the entire width of the web page. Now, when you hit refresh, you can see that that line is much wider when our entire page is wider, and when our page gets narrower, it always remains 30% of the entire width. So that's another way that you can specify a size. Now, as a challenge, I want you to use this page on MDN, the border style property, and looking at all the different types of border styles, I want you to be able to make this line similar to what Sean has here, which is just a few gray dots, maybe 3 or 4, or maybe just 10% of the page. So pause the video and see if you can change the CSS in order to make that line look like this. All right, so how did that go? Now, in order to make our horizontal rule look similar to this, we know that we can change the border style. And one of those styles is the dotted style. And MDN very helpfully has this interactive box where we can change the properties of these borders. So we already know that we can't have a border to be set to none. We're going to need it to be dotted. But if we simply change this border style to dotted and hit save, then you can see if I zoom in that yes, I have a border that's dotted around my horizontal rule, but this looks nothing like what he's got over here. So how can we change this? Well, if we only want to have a single border, then we have to turn our height down to 0 again. So we have a box that's 0 pixels high that only has a border. So you can either change the height to 0 pixels or delete it outright, and that will also make it 0 pixels high. Now if I refresh, you can see that we've now got a horizontal rule that's 0 pixels high, and we've got a border around it. So if we have a look here at the syntax section, it says that when one value for border style is specified, then it applies the same style to all 4 sides. And that's pretty much what we're getting here. We're getting that dotted style across all 4 sides. Now, when we specify 2 values, then the first styles apply to the top and bottom borders, and the second to the left and right. When 3 values are specified, then the first one applies to the top, the second to the left and the right, and the third to the bottom. Or you can also specify all 4 values of all 4 sides. So knowing this, we can actually change our border style to dotted. So that gets applied to the top border, and then we can specify none for the rest of the borders. And if we hit save, we go back over here, we refresh, you see that we now only have the top border showing. Now, an alternative way that you might have worked out is by simply changing the border top style. So we could say that the entire border style is none, but the border top style is going to be dotted. And if you hit save and you refresh, you can see that it's exactly the same effect. Because we're specifying something that is more specific than this property, we're affecting only this particular thing. And now our background color is redundant because our main box has no background because it has no height. So we can get rid of that. Now, in order to make this line look more like this line, we have to change the size of the dots and also the color of the dots. And you can see that we can change the color by simply changing the border color property. So we can change it to gray, and we can also change the border width. So if we say 20 pixels, then the dots get a lot bigger, whereas 5 pixels, you only get very tiny dots. So let's go over here and add some more properties that we want to change. So we're going to change the border color to gray, and we're going to change the border height, and then we're going to change the border width to, let's try 20 pixels. And let's see what that now looks like. Ooh, that's absolutely massive. And our border is still black. So what's going on here? It's because we have a typo in the word gray. And you can see that using our packages that we've installed in Atom, when it's actually a valid color code, it gets highlighted in a different color compared to something that doesn't exist. So let's change that down to maybe, let's try 10 pixels. And that is now looking pretty similar to that size. Maybe smaller still, maybe 5 pixels. Yeah. That looks pretty similar. And we can change it down to be a lot smaller in width as well. So let's say maybe put the width as maybe 10% or even smaller, maybe 5%. Yeah, that looks pretty decent. So we've now more or less implemented what we see over here simply by changing the CSS style of our horizontal rule. Now, there's still a bit of a problem though, because we've changed our horizontal rule to look exactly the way that we want it to. And we of course want this to be consistent across our website. And we also want our background color to carry over to all our other web pages on our website. But if we look inside my hobbies or contact me, it still looks exactly the same way as it did before. And we're going to have to copy this entire style section over to the contact me header as well as the hobbies header. So that's kind of a lot of work, especially if you end up with a website with, 200 pages. Then it's not a good idea to have to copy this over and change it in every single place. This might be easier than using inline CSS as we did in the last lesson, but it's still quite repetitive. What we really want is to have a single location where when we change the CSS styles in that one location, then everything gets reflected across our website in all of the pages. So that is what we're going to learn about in the next lesson, where we look into how we can create external CSS for our website. So stay tuned and I will see you in the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can implement a CSS style and apply it to all instances of a particular HTML element on a single page. So we changed the style for our horizontal rule, and by adding this internal CSS to our index.html page, we managed to affect the style of all the horizontal rules on the same page. Now, we're going to take it one step further, and we're going to change our website that uses internal CSS to external CSS. And to do that, we first have to create a new folder in our personal site. So I'm going to create a new folder that's called simply CSS. And inside this folder, I'm going to create a new file. And that file is going to be called styles.css. So with that extension, the browser will recognize it as a CSS file. So once you hit enter, you'll see that we have this brand new file called styles.css. And we're going to move our code for the body and the horizontal rule over to this page. I'm going to hit save, and we're going to remove this style tag. So now if I hit save and I refresh our website, you can see that all the style that we've applied is now gone because we've deleted it from the style tag in the header. Now, instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create a new link. And if you write link and you hit enter, then it will autofill to say that this link has a relationship of something called the style sheet. So when your browser reads your web page, it'll go from the top to the bottom, and once it hits this line, it'll see that, oh, this is where the style sheet for this web page resides, and I can go over here to fetch it. Now we need to change this href to point towards our styles.css. So the first thing we need to change is the file name. Our file is not called master.css, it's called styles.css. And the other thing that we have to change is this / here. Now, if an href starts off with a /, then it's pointing towards the root of your website. It's saying that you'll find this file inside a folder called CSS inside the root of your website. Now, we're going to talk about the root a little bit later on, especially once we start getting into JavaScript. But for now, just know that when you have a static website that's not yet hosted anywhere, you can't tap into this file using the root. So instead, we're going to say that this file resides in a folder called CSS, and it's on the same level as this current file. So index.html is here, and on the same level as it, there is a folder called CSS, inside of which there is a file called styles.css. And that is going to be our style sheet. So your browser then takes this file, here, then applies all of these styles to the specified elements inside your index.html. So let's hit save and let's refresh our page to make sure that it worked. And it has. So this is what we call the external CSS. And if we apply this style sheet to our Contact Me page as well as our Hobbies page, then you'll see that once we go to it, then you'll see that all of our styles get applied across all 3 pages. And all we had to do is just to add this simple link that points towards this external style sheet. And anything that we change in this single location will affect all 3 web pages. So we'll know that the style is consistent across all 3 pages. Now, as a challenge, I want you to select the H1 and the H3 elements on all 3 pages, and I want you to change its color property to this particular color that we had on Color Hunt, so 66BFBF. And by the end of it, you should end up with your site looking similar to this, where on all 3 pages, the H1s and the H3s are colored in this new shade. Now remember, if you don't know which CSS property to change, or if the property that you're trying to change isn't working, you can always go to Google and say, change text color CSS. And that will help you figure out which property you need to change. So go ahead, pause the video, and give it a go. All right, so how did that go? Well, if you had any difficulty figuring out which property you need to change, because it's a property that we haven't used before, then you needed to look at some of the documentation. And in this case, for example, changing the text using CSS, the first thing that it talks about is changing the text color, which is exactly what we want to do. And it tells you that the property that you need is something called color. And you can specify the color, just as we did before for the background color, with a name or with a hex value or with an RGB value. So our value that we had was here, which is 66BFBF. We're going to copy it and we're going to go into the styles.css, so our external style sheet, and we're going to select the element that we want to change, which is the H1 as well as the H3. And the property that we want to change was called color, and the value that we're going to give it is the hex code 66BFBF, and we want that to be true in both cases. So now if you hit save and you go over to your site and you hit refresh, then the black text becomes that nice green turquoisey color, and the changes are also reflected in Hobbies and Contact Me. So did you get that right? Did you manage to figure out which property you needed to change? If yes, then great, perfect. If you want to take this challenge even further, then you can style the text in more ways than we've specified here by looking through the documentation and changing anything that you want to change. So, for example, it's a bit odd to have the H1 the same color as the H3, so you could differentiate those two by making the styles of each of them different. Now, if you've created something wonderful, wacky, or completely different from what I have, then it's a good time to show off what you've done and head over to the Q&A section and show all of your fellow students and post a screenshot of what your website looks like and which CSS properties you changed in order to achieve it. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to look at some potential bugs that you might come across and ways in which you can help yourself by diagnosing what the problem is and how you can fix it yourself. So we're starting to learn about the important skill of debugging. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last few lessons, we looked at why CSS is useful and how you can implement it using inline, internal, or external CSS. Now, in this lesson, we're going to start to develop a really important skill, and that is debugging your code. Inevitably, as a developer of any sort, web, mobile, backend, you will write code that have logical flaws or that have typos, because we are all human and we make mistakes. And it's really important to learn the skill of diagnosing your bugs. So when something doesn't work the way you expect it to, how can you figure out what is the cause and how do you go about fixing it? And so in this lesson, in the resources, you'll find two text files, one called debugging problem 1 and the other one called debugging problem 2. And what I want you to do is to go inside your index.html and hit Command A or Control A to select everything. Now we're going to replace the code that's inside your index.html with each of the debugging problems. Now, if you've made notes in your index.html, or if you want to keep a copy of the actual working code that you've already written, make sure that after you've selected everything inside HTML, go ahead and paste this into a notepad or into another file that you save as the working index.html, or give it some sort of name. Now, after we replace this with the debugging problem, if you wanted to go back to your original index.html, you can always hit undo in Atom. And the shortcut for that is Command Z in Mac, and it's Control Z on Windows. And you can undo for as far back as you want to. So once you've saved a copy of your original index.html, and then hit backspace to delete everything. Next, you're going to go to the course resources. And again, if you don't remember how to find that, have a look at the beginning of lesson 3 where I talk about this. Now, inside the course resources, you'll find a section that says download the debugging problem starting files. Once you've downloaded that, you'll need to unzip that zipped folder, and you should have a folder called CSS debugging problems. Now you're going to go to Atom, you're going to go to File, Open, and you're going to navigate to that folder in your downloads and make sure that you haven't selected the zipped version. Select the file and then open up debugging problem 1. And you're going to hit Command A or Control A to select everything, and then you're going to hit Command or Control C, and then you're going to copy all of this code over to your index.html. And then you're going to hit save, and you're going to refresh your page to see that, oh, what happened? Where did all of our beautiful CSS styling go? And this is your first challenge to debug and fix the code and try to figure out what's going on here. So pause the video and give it a go. All right, so you might have found out the issue by painstakingly going through the code line by line. Now, you might have also not found the bug. So let me walk you through a workflow of how you can approach debugging now and also in the future. So the first thing that we're going to use is we're going to pull up the Chrome developer tools. And this is one of the reasons why we're using Chrome to develop our websites and web apps, even though perhaps there are other browsers that you might prefer using on a day-to-day basis. And one of the reasons is because of something called the Chrome developer tools. So if you head over to the 3 dots in the top right of your Chrome browser, click on it, and then go to More Tools, you should find the developer tools over there. And if you click on it, it brings up this console. So there's a whole bunch of tabs here, including network, performance, sources, elements. And we've checked out elements before when we right-clicked on something and we said inspect. That's what we were bringing up. We were bringing up the Chrome developer tools. So if we head over to console, then you can see that Chrome is actually reporting an error here to you. And it's telling you that it failed to load the resource, and there's an error where the file that you're trying to pull up is not found. And it tells you what file it's trying to look for. It's trying to look for something at /css/styles.css. So if we go over to our code and we look at the part where we ask the browser to load this particular file /css/styles.css, then we will find it over here on line 6. And this shows you the problem that I spoke about earlier, whereby I said that the href, or the URL location of our styles.css, exists in the CSS folder at the same hierarchical level as our index.html. But I've very sneakily added this leading /, and that makes this link relative to the root. Whereas without that leading /, it makes this link relative to the subdirectory that the index.html exists in. So without the link, we're looking inside HTML personal site for a folder called css/styles.css. With the leading /, we're looking for the root of the website, which we currently don't actually have. So all we need to do to fix this bug is to delete that leading /, hit save, and refresh our website. You'll see that error in the console now disappears, and our styles are restored to our page. So that's the solution for the first debugging problem. Did you manage to get it right? Now let's move on to the second debugging problem. So again, similarly, we're going to hit Command or Control A and delete everything inside our index.html. We're going to go to debugging problem 2, and we're going to copy everything over. Going to hit save, and we're going to refresh our website. And again, something has broken, but it hasn't broken as dramatically as previously. Now I want you to pause the video and figure out how we can restore it to the previous look and feel by fixing our code. So pause the video now and give it a go. So the first step of debugging always starts with identifying the problem. What is the problem here? Well, our background used to be a light green color and now it's white. But the other parts of our CSS hasn't broken. So for example, our horizontal rule is still correctly formatted. Our H1 and H3 are also formatted using our external CSS. So it's probably not to do with the location of the style sheet. So the only issue that we need to fix is, why is it that the background is white, but in our style sheet, we said that the body's background should be our light green color? Why is that not happening? Well, let's go ahead and pull up our Chrome developer tools again. And if we look inside elements and we select the body here, and we go over to this styles section over here, then you can see that it's showing us all of the CSS that's being applied to the body of our web page. And that includes setting the background color to white, as well as setting the background color to our specified hex code, that light green color, as well as changing the display and the margin. And we're seeing that the color that we desire, which we set inside our style sheet, is being crossed out and overridden by this white color. And if you look carefully inside our new buggy index.html, then the keen-eyed amongst you might have spotted that I set an inline CSS rule inside the body tag to turn the body's background color to white, which explains why our page looks like this. But what it doesn't explain is, why is it that this one is being used, but this one is not? If we specify CSS rules for the same property in different places, which one is more important? Well, we can use the Chrome developer tools to help us answer that question. So I'm going to keep the body's background color in the inline CSS as white, I'm also going to add a style tag here. And inside this style tag, I'm going to change the body's background color to, let's say, red. And I'm going to make this color a little bit more obvious. So let's change this to blue. Hit save and refresh our page, and you'll see that it stays white. But now if we select this line and we select our body element, you can see that this is the Elements tab for viewing the elements. Then you can see that there's 3 colors that are being applied to our body, and 2 of them are crossed out. The red color, which comes from index.html on line 10, which is, of course, our internal CSS. And then we've got the white color, which is being applied on the style attribute of the actual body element, as you can see here. And finally, we've got some CSS rule being applied inside our file called styles.css on line 2. So styles.css on line 2 is the rule where we're setting the background color to blue. Now inside Chrome, you can untick that top level background color, and it goes down to the next most important thing. And this is the equivalent of deleting this inline CSS rule from the body tag. And that means that it defaults to the next most important CSS rule, which is the one on our index.html on line 10. That is our internal CSS. And if you untick that one, which is the equivalent of deleting this part here, then and only then does it go to our styles.css, applying the background color to be blue. Now remember that when you're ticking and unticking these things inside Chrome, it affects how the web page gets displayed, but it does not change your code. So if I hit refresh right now, then it goes back to how it will be displayed across all the browsers if this website was live. So the Chrome tool is only for you to mess around with it locally and see what those changes, for example, removing this line here. Do you see how by ticking and unticking that, it just commented out that particular CSS rule? And it shows you what the effects are without affecting the code behind it. So let's go ahead and affect the code, because what we've learned is that by having inline CSS, internal CSS, as well as external CSS, all affecting the same property of the same element, the priority is given to the inline element. So that's what's making our background white. Now, if I delete this CSS rule from here, save and refresh, then it goes to the next most important CSS rule, which is the one inside our internal CSS over here. And if I delete this internal CSS and hit save and refresh, then and only then does it go to the next most important rule, which is our external CSS. So this describes the hierarchy of these 3 different ways of implementing CSS. And what it means is that you can apply a global CSS rule to all of your web pages, but on the individual web pages, you can apply more specific rules through using internal or inline CSS as more or less one-off changes for that specific page or that specific element on that page. So let's restore our website to the way that it was before, and you can mess around with implementing your CSS in those 3 different ways and see how the importance of those rules depend on where you write it. Now, in terms of best practice, as a web designer, it's usually suggested that you implement all of your styles inside your external CSS. Now, in the next lesson, we're going to look more closely at the CSS syntax and what a CSS rule is composed of. So for all of that and more, I'll see you on the next lesson. All right, so now that we've seen all the places where we can include CSS in order to change the style of our website, then now is a good time to review the CSS syntax. And you hear this word syntax a lot when you're dealing with programmers or programming, and all that it refers to is just the grammar of the CSS language. Just as in English, we have grammatical rules which state where you should put commas, where you should have full stops, which words need to be capitalized, etc., etc. All programming languages also have their own particular syntax. So let's take a look at what CSS looks like. Now, the first thing that you'll see is the selector, and this comes at the beginning of the CSS rule. And then comes a pair of curly braces, inside which is where your CSS rules are going to reside. And the rule will change the appearance of some property and give it a new value. And each rule has to end with a semicolon at the end. And that is kind of equivalent to the full stops that we see in our English sentences. Essentially, the selector is basically just the who. So who is it that you want to modify in your web page? Is it the H1? Is it the paragraph tags? Is it the image tags? Whose style do you want to change? And the next part is the property. And this is the what. What about that H1 do you want to change? Is it the background color? Is it the text color? Is it its position? And finally, we've got the value, and that is the how. So how do you want to change the background color of the H1? Do you want it to be blue? Do you want it to be red? And that's the value that you're going to give in order to change it. So whenever you get stuck thinking about CSS, this is a good time point in the video to come back to, just to remind yourself what are each of the parts inside the CSS code that you are changing in order to affect the style. So let's look at a real life example. Here I have a website that is dedicated to the true love of my life, which is bacon. And all that I've got in this website is an H1 for the I love bacon heading. And I've got 3 separate paragraphs that just say bacon, 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 which is what I hear in my head most of the time, especially around lunchtime, which it is right now. So, and finally, I've got an image of a piece of bacon. So if I decided to apply some CSS to my website, say, let's change the H1's color to the color red. Now in this case, the who is of course the H1. That's what I'm trying to select, and that's why it's called the selector. And the color, of course, is the what. And finally, the how I'm going to change that color is the value, which in this case it's red. And by applying the CSS rule, I end up changing the H1's color property to red. Now let's take a look at that in real life. If you look inside the resources of this lesson, you will find a zip file called Bacon Fansite that you will be able to download. And once you unzip it and extract the files inside, you should find a folder called CSS-Bacon Fansite. Now go ahead and take this folder, CSS Bacon Fansite, and drag it into your project sidebar right here below the other project. Now, if you want to get rid of the previous project, just click on the top HTML project file and then remove project folder. And ignore this DS store. This is something that just gets created automatically on macOS. You can delete it if you want to, but it doesn't actually do anything. So now you should have this index.html file in your Atom project folder. And here I've already written a little bit of code in order to create the bare HTML bones of our bacon fan site. Now, I know that some of you guys might be vegan or vegetarian or pescatarian or whatever it may be. If my love of bacon offends you in any way, then I am deeply apologetic, and you can feel free to change or update this website to whatever it is that you worship, like broccoli or spinach, but my thing is bacon. So here we go. So here's the base website. And as the first challenge, I want you to pause this video and create a new folder called CSS, inside which you'll create a new file called styles.css. And then you're going to link that file to this current HTML file using an external link. So we're using external CSS. So pause the video and give it a go. All right, that shouldn't have been too hard. If it was, make sure you look at some of the previous videos where we spoke about inline, internal, and external CSS. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside our CSS-bacon fan site, and I'm going to call it CSS. Inside the CSS folder, I'm going to create a new file called styles.css. And now styles.css is inside a folder called CSS at the same hierarchical level at index.html. So I can go inside the head of this website and I can insert a link that has a relationship of style sheet, and the href is css/styles.css. So now if I hit save, and I can just check to make sure that it's actually been linked up by tapping into the body, changing the background color, which we've done before, and let's just change it to red. Let's go ahead and save everything, hit refresh, and we can verify that it's all linked up and it's all working. Now, I don't really actually want to have a red background for my bacon website. It seems a little bit too fanatical. But instead, we're going to add that CSS rule that we saw earlier on, where we change the text color of the H1 to a red color. So first things first, who am I trying to change? It's of course going to be the H1 in this case. I'm going to open a set of curly brackets, and then I'm going to add the property, or the what. And in this case, it's of course the color property, and I'm going to change its value to red. And of course, remember that the CSS syntax requires that you close off the line with a semicolon. Now, all the parts that we've mentioned in the CSS syntax slides are really, really important. And sometimes you might forget, or you might accidentally remove something, and it will break the code. So let me show you what I mean. For example, if we forgot to put in that, then we can't differentiate between the what and the how, and it'll think that all of this is the what, or the properties we want to change. So that doesn't work. And if you hit save, then the linter inside Atom will actually give you this error saying it expected a colon on line 1, column 12. So you can see your lines and columns down here, and you can see that currently we're on line 1, column 11. So this is line 1, column 12. And this is where it expected a colon. Now, with the colon, if we refresh our website, you can see that it changed our H1 to have a red text color. But without that colon, then you can see that it doesn't affect the style at all. It's not a valid CSS rule. So let's put that colon back in, and let's go ahead and add another rule to modify our H1. Let's change the font size to something really, really huge. Let's say 200 pixels. So let's hit save, let's refresh. You can see we've got this massive title saying, I love bacon. So you can have more than one rule that's applied to the same selector. And very often you'll actually apply many, many rules to the same selector. And you can either have them in line, but as you can imagine, as you get more and more rules, you're going to run out of space pretty quickly. So by convention, most people will write CSS with the selector, the open curly bracket, then each CSS rule will go onto a new line. And this way you can clearly see and make sure that each line ends with a semicolon and each of the properties are separated from the values by a colon. Now, there's another sort of best practice is that once you start getting a lot of these rules, say, 20 all in one paragraph, then it starts getting hard finding them. So usually the best practice is to keep all of these rules in alphabetical order. And in fact, if you put font size before color and you hit save, Atom will actually give you a warning telling you that the linter advises that the best practice is have all of your properties in alphabetical order. That way, when you come to debugging or trying to figure out what's going wrong, then it'll be much, much easier to find each and every property that you're looking for. Now, as you might have seen, it's quite easy to find the who because we're just looking at the HTML element, for example, the h1 tag, and we're simply ignoring the angle brackets of the tag, and we're just picking up on the name of the HTML element to use as our selector. Now, as a challenge, I want you to change the background of this bacon image to red as well. So take a look at the index.html and implement your CSS code inside styles.css. So pause the video and give that a go. All right, so how did that go? Now, of course, the easy part is the who in this case, which is the image tag. And we're not including any of the other attributes like source or alt text, etc. We're just interested in that red part, which is the name of the HTML element. So we're going to go into our styles.css and we're going to target our selector, which is, of course, the image tag. Then we're going to open a set of curly braces, and inside we're going to define our rule. And the property that I wanted you to change for the image was its background color, and we want to change it to red as well. So let's hit save and let's hit refresh, and you can see we've now got a bacon image that has a red background. Now at this point it seems easy to see how to find the who, right? The image or the p tag or the h1, whatever it is that you want to change, you simply use it as the selector inside your CSS code. Now, what about the what or the properties? How do we know what keywords we can and can't use and what they will affect? Well, you guessed it. This is where we go back to the web docs. So if you have a look on the MDN homepage and you go to technologies and you go to CSS and then you go to their CSS reference, you can see that it talks about the syntax, but more importantly, it has this entire directory of keywords, which are effectively our properties. So these are the whats that we can change. And you'll find everything that we've used so far, for example, background color or font size or whatever it is that you're looking for. And these are all of the generic properties that you can change using CSS rules. And if you click on each of them, then it'll take you to a more detailed page where it shows you how you can implement the code and what different types of code will do for your styling. So have a play around with all of these different properties and see what other things you can do to make this bacon fan site look more the way that you want it to. And once you're done, I'll see you on the next lesson. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at the simplest type of CSS selectors, and that is selecting based on the HTML tags. Now in this lesson, I want to show you the other things that you can use as selectors in order to make more specific changes to your website. So for example, we have this image of a piece of bacon. Now what if I wanted to have another image that was a broccoli, and I want to show people how much I dislike broccoli? Then I could go to Emojipedia and I could search for broccoli, and I found my broccoli. And this is a really cool website because it lists all of the emoji graphics from different operating systems. So this is Apple's version of a broccoli emoji, and this is Google's, this is Microsoft. Not sure that this looks more like a tree than a broccoli. But feel free to go through this list and see what emoji you prefer. I quite like this one. I think it's most realistic. And then just go ahead and right click and copy the image address. And we're going to use that as the source of our image. And you can see up here, this is exactly the same way how I got the image for our bacon. And I'm just going to add an alt text just in case the image doesn't display. And I'm going to say this is the broccoli dash image. So now if I hit save and I go to my bacon fan site, you can see that my broccoli now shows up. But the curious thing is that my broccoli also has a red background, even though I just put it on screen. I didn't even have time to look at the styles yet. So why is that? Well, if we take a look inside style.css, you can see that by targeting the image tag, we're applying this red background color to every single image inside our website. And that might be what you want, but in most cases, that's not really specific enough. And in my case, what I'd like to do is that I want to have the bacon to have a green background color to say, eat more bacon, and the broccoli to have a red background color to say, broccoli is evil. So how can I achieve that? Well, I can't do that just by using tag selectors. So I have to go a little bit more advanced in my CSS, and I have to use class selectors. So if you head into your index.html, and after the image tag, we're going to add another attribute. So remember, HTML attributes are things like the source or the alt tag, etc. And the one that we want to add now is the class attribute. Now the class attribute allows us to differentiate all of our different HTML elements. So for example, for this bacon image, I'm going to give the class a name of bacon. And for the broccoli image, I'm going to name this class broccoli. So now what I can do is, instead of coloring all the images red, so I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. So in CSS, commenting is a little bit different from HTML in the sense that we have to use a /, a asterisk, and then to end the block of comments, we use another asterisk and a /. So everything in between the asterisks will be commented out and won't be considered as code. So let's give our CSS file some sections, shall we? Let's say that the top section are our tag selectors, and the next section are our class selectors. So inside this section, I'm going to tap into that bacon class in order to only change the styling for the bacon image and give it a background color of green. So to target a class rather than a tag, the only difference is a full stop or a dot in front of the class. So my class is called bacon. So to use it as a selector, I just say dot bacon, and the rest of the CSS rule looks exactly the same. And I'm going to say that for the bacon class, I want their background color to be green. But for the broccoli class, now make sure you don't have any typos, because if you misspell the selector, the property, or the value, you might not get what you expect. For example, what I've done here, because they all need to be spelled exactly the same way as you spelled it inside your HTML code when you gave the class a name. So for our broccoli image, we want the background color to be red. So now if we hit save, then what's going to happen is that different styles will be applied to our two images. So even though they're both image HTML elements, because this one has a class of bacon, it's going to have a background color of green, as we specified. And because this one has a class of broccoli, it's going to have a background color of red. So let's just quickly verify. And there we go. We've got our bacon that's colored in green, telling you how healthy it is. And we've got our broccoli colored in red, telling you how it's probably not edible. So for things like paragraph elements or image elements or anchor tags, then it's very, very rare that you'll want to style them exactly the same way. So by using the class as the selector, you can better differentiate and make more specific styling choices for your website elements. Now, in the last lesson, we looked at how we can use class selectors instead of tag selectors. And this gave us way more flexibility and allowed us to specify the styles that we wanted for individual image tags or individual HTML elements. Now, if you're looking at CSS selectors, you might also come across the ID selector. And the ID selector is a little bit different from the class selector, although they do have some similarities. So let's try an example. Inside this H1, I'm going to add an ID attribute, and this is going to have an ID called heading. Now, in order to change the style of my heading and target the heading ID, I have to specify my selector slightly differently. So let's create a new section down here called ID selectors, and I'll show you how you can select it. So remember, our ID is called heading, and in order to target it, I need to use the hash symbol, or some might call it the pound sign. And then I'm going to add the name of that ID, which was called heading, and the rest of it is exactly the same. So let's make the color of the heading blue, shall we? And let's hit save and refresh. And you can see that even though we've got the H1 still specified as having a red text color, because our ID and our class selectors are more specific, this style will override this one. And if you have a look inside the Chrome Developer Tools, selecting the H1, you can see that we've got the H1 color being red, but it's crossed out because the ID heading is more specific, and therefore this is the one that we see on our website. Now, this is the same for our class selectors. For example, let's get rid of these comments to put this back online. And we can see that we're saying that all images should have a background color of red, but the bacon class should have a background color of green. And if I hit save and I refresh, absolutely nothing changes. And that's because if we have a look inside the Chrome Developer Tools and we select our bacon image, then you can see that the image tag selector is specifying that the background color should be red, but our bacon class overrides that because it's more specific, and this is saying that it should be green, and that is what we see on screen. So that is one similarity between classes and IDs. Now, people get very, very confused about when should you use IDs, when should you use classes, because they seem like they're kind of similar, right? Well, one of the big differences between the two is that you can only have a single instance of one particular ID name inside a single page. So I can't, for example, go into the paragraph tag and say that this one's ID is also called heading. And you'll see that Atom gives me this error saying that heading must be unique. I can only use this ID in one place. But whereas with class, it doesn't really matter. I can say that this class is bacon. I can say this class is bacon. Everybody's class is bacon. Doesn't matter at all. So you would use the ID to identify elements where there is only a single one of them on a particular page. For example, there's probably just going to be one heading Or if you had a navigation bar, you're probably only going to have one navigation bar on your website. But for the class, you can use it to group related elements that are all going to behave or have a similar style. For instance, if you had a blog and you wanted to style all the comments on the blog pages, then they're probably going to look exactly the same as each other. So they might all have the same class value. So use classes when you want to apply the same style to a group of related items, and use the ID to apply a specific style to a single element on your web page. And some say the analogy is kind of like name versus passport, where anybody can have the same name, right? There's many Angelas, I'm sure, across the world, but there's only one person with my particular passport number, and that uniquely identifies me across all of the other humans in the world. So the similarities are they're both used to identify HTML elements that you want to style, and CSS doesn't actually care what you use. If I said ID equals heading here or class equals heading and applied the style, it doesn't actually matter. CSS doesn't care. The other similarity between IDs and classes, as we mentioned before, is that they are more specific than the tag selectors, and any of these styles will override any tag selector styles that are applied to the same element. The other thing that you'll notice is that some of these tags have predefined CSS styles that are applied by the browser. So for example, the H1, if we have a look inside our Chrome Developer Tools and I select the H1, then you can see that these user agent style sheets, this comes from the browser, and this is applied no matter what CSS style you put down. But if you do specify something using a tag selector inside your CSS file, for example, here for the H1, I said that the font size should be 200 pixels. And that overrides the default size for the browser. And it can be further overridden using IDs or classes. Now, the differences between IDs and classes, which is what trips up most people, and the first thing to remember is that a particular ID can only be used once on this page. So I can only have this heading ID once on this page, but I can have more than one ID. So I can say maybe this one's ID is called first paragraph, but I cannot use this again anywhere else inside the same page. The other difference is that any HTML element can have more than one class, but it can only have one ID. So what does this mean? Well, let's say that I wanted my broccoli image to be circular, then we can change the border radius as we did previously. And I can do that by adding another class to my broccoli image called circular. And if I go into my style sheet and I target this circular class, then I can specify that its border radius should be 100%, which is going to be circular. So now that circular border radius is going to be applied to this image alongside the styles for the broccoli class. So if we hit save and refresh, you'll see that my broccoli image is now circular, but my bacon image is left completely alone. And I've implemented this by adding two classes to the same HTML element. Now, you can't do the same thing with ID. So let's add another ID, for example, called big, and we tried putting it down here. And let's use it to change the font size to something ridiculous like 1000 pixels. Let's hit save and refresh. You can see that all the styles for that heading ID are now removed because this is not a valid ID. You can't have more than one ID for a particular element. So that is another difference between classes and IDs. Now in practice, and when you look at CSS code in the wild, you'll see people use classes absolutely everywhere. You'll see tag selectors being used broadly to affect the appearance of HTML elements, but you'll see IDs used more sparingly. And in fact, the linter for CSS on Atom actually suggests against using IDs as a selector to change the style. Now, I don't entirely agree with that because I think there are cases where it can be useful, but you do have to think very carefully when you do decide to use it. Now, the last thing I want to show you with regards to CSS selectors is something called a pseudo class. And if we have a look inside the CSS reference, amongst all of the different properties and their keywords, you can see that some of these have a little colon in front of them. And these are pseudo classes. And this is because HTML elements can have different states. So for example, when I hover over a piece of text or an image, that's actually a different state. And I can get the CSS to change based on the state, i.e. hovering over or not hovering over, by using these pseudo classes that have a colon in front. And the one that you'll see the most often is the hover pseudo class. And this is what it looks like. So you can select the hovered state of any HTML element in order to affect its style. So let's go ahead and do that for our image tag. Let's say that when our HTML image elements are hovered over, or you might know it as rollover or mouse over, but when our images are in this particular state, let's say that the background color should be maybe a gold color. Let's hit save and let's refresh our site and let's check it out. So if I go ahead and hover over my images, you can see that it changes the background color to this gold color simply by using that pseudo class of hover. So take a look at some of these properties and different ways of using selectors and use it to mess around with your website to personalize it even more.